The end of Rome, the disintegration of the Western Empire. Today we remember Rome as one of the greatest empires to have ever existed, and for more than one reason. However, every empire falls, and Rome was no exception. So, how exactly did Rome fall? And what does one mean when they say the fall of Rome? This question is, not surprisingly, messy and complicated and actually misleading in itself. Because in reality, Rome lived on to become what came to be known as the Byzantine Empire. So when we were talking about the fall of Rome, we are actually talking about the disintegration of the Western Empire. The west half had always been the weaker half, and hence more likely to fall. However, economic problems including inflation, high taxes, and a decline in trade were responsible in part for the decline of the empire as a whole. In addition, problems with the military and the government were present. Symptoms of decentralization including the rise of large estates. The weakening of Rome made it easier for Germanic tribesmen to conquer and break apart the Western Empire. This conclusion leads to a basic question. Why were there two halves to begin with? What made the west half fall apart? A good place to begin is with the geographic differences. The West was exposed to invaders and therefore had to invest a lot more into defending against foreign invasions. The East was more geographically protected, but it also had more established and larger cities, which helped it to deal with any problems it had much more easily. In addition, in 330, the Emperor Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, where present-day Istanbul is. Due to depopulation that occurred in the 3rd century, the West had less people and in turn less soldiers. So it had to rely a lot more on Germanic mercenaries. The East did not have to and had a much easier time collecting taxes because there were more people. Additionally, many changes brought about by Diocletian were important to deepening the divide between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire.
Aside from splitting Rome into two parts, Diocletian essentially created a bureaucracy. However, this newly established bureaucracy had minimal representation of the people. Instead, centered mostly around the higher-ups such as the emperors referred to as Augusti and their co-leaders, the Caesars. The idea behind the creation of the Augusti and the Caesar positions was that people becoming rulers would become. Then, once the Augustus spot was open, the previous Caesar would take up said spot, and another worthy Caesar would be chosen. However, under this new system of governing, emperors achieved status so high they may have even been regarded as godlike. In his eyes, the people were increasingly less and less important, and this led to a particularly top-heavy system of governing. He also took away power from the provincial governors, increasing the number of provinces to 100, giving them less governing area and reducing the risk of an uprising. Instead, handfuls of provincial governors were under the control of the newly established dioceses. These 13 dioceses were then further governed by vicari, who in turn were by the 4 praetorian prefects, otherwise known as the tetrarch administrators. Alongside the provinces, he also changed the army, expanding its numbers and separating it into 2 different parts. One was essentially border patrol, guarding the frontiers of the empire. The other was like the National Guard, going wherever they are needed. However, with this increase in the army's size, there was an increase in soldiers that wanted their pay. This only furthered the downfall of the economy.
Even with the East and West divided, Rome still had to be weakened quite a bit before the Germanic tribesmen would be successful in taking over the Western Empire. A series of economic, social, and political changes began to occur, and they were often interrelated, or they were simply just symptoms of a weakened empire. Many of the problems began in the 3rd century CE, with a notable decline in the population. This came as a result of plague and civil war. Less people overall meant less people who could work in the fields. Agriculture declined and there were less crops being produced. The prices in crops also increased significantly. Manufacturing also declined because there was less of a demand for tools. Additionally, a disruption of agriculture and manufacturing led to a decline in trade. Product quality was poor and there were less items to trade. However, many of the problems in what was formerly known as the 3rd century crisis was the result of the debasement of coins. The value of coins decreased as the amount of silver in them decreased.
A decreased amount of silver meant that each coin was worth less.
So prices were increased to compensate. This ended up causing rapid inflation where the prices of goods rose far faster than the wages of people. Additionally, it became extremely difficult for the government to keep up with costs, and hence they needed to raise taxes. This process resulted in a vicious cycle. Once the currency was debased and inflation occurred, soldiers ended up demanding higher wages. When this happened, the empire raised taxes to compensate for the soldiers. Imagine that we have a poor citizen and a rich citizen, as well as a government. Both individuals have a certain amount of money, and they both have to pay taxes to the government. However, what ends up happening is that the poor individual ends up paying more of his money than the rich person pays. And thus the poor got poorer and the rich stayed rich. One more economic problem was the increase of tenant farming. The inflation and raised taxes managed to cause poor individuals to either flee the Roman Empire or to become tenant farmers. These tenant farmers had to serve the wealthy individuals to get paid a certain salary. However, they would not be able to own any land, and they had to purchase food, clothes, and other necessities from the wealthy landowners. This in turn gave the landlords more power because they had income from their crops, and the poor tenant farmers also had to pay them for clothes and other necessities. They used this wealth to gain power in the empire. The power then became decentralized. This was all incredibly similar to the decline of the Han Empire in China. In the Han Empire, many individuals and officials managed to gain power, which created a disunified government. Depopulation caused problems for the military as well. First, the inflation made it harder for the government to pay their soldiers. Hence, revolts will be more common, and this was part of the internal conflict that was already occurring. Depopulation also led to a need for more soldiers. To solve this problem, the army hired Germanic tribesmen as mercenaries. This led to the army becoming more and more barbarized in the West. Problems with revolts and discipline caused the Roman army to become weak. In turn, it was harder to defend against frequent invasions.